You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. The Trump administration's efforts to deport more unauthorized immigrants have led to protests in major cities across the United States, led by Los Angeles. In a speech Tuesday night, Governor Gavin Newsom denounced the president's decision to send 700 Marines and 4,000 National Guard troops to Southern California to quell demonstrations.
Democracy is under assault before our eyes. This moment we have feared has arrived.
The protests were sparked by ICE worksite raids, including at a clothing company. Evidence of stepped-up immigration enforcement can also be seen at the U.S. Canada border, but it's not always drawing protests or media attention. This next story starts with the detention of a family of 6 at the Blaine border crossing beginning in late April. The family, originally from southwestern Africa, was held by Customs and Border Protection in a windowless cell with a toilet for 24 days, more than 3 weeks in one room, with no news stories and few people aware of their situation. The ACLU is now involved in the case. Troy Brynelson is a reporter for Oregon Public Broadcasting who wrote about the family's ordeal once they got back home to North Seattle. Troy, thank you very much for being here and for your reporting.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You've chosen to withhold their names and their home country of this family, but what can you tell us about who they are and what happened here?
This is a family of 6, 2 parents and 4 children. And like you said, we have not been naming them or providing the country where they are originally from because they fear political persecution in their home country. And that is part of what allowed them to come into the United States in the first place. This family, when they left their home country, they traveled to Brazil, where they were for a number of years. And then just last year, they came into the United States. And as part of the immigration process, they were able to convince immigration officials that they had a, quote, credible fear of returning to their home country. And so that allowed them this temporary status in the United States. We know that they spent several months at a church outside Tukwila, Washington, where they were at first staying in the church, then moved into a tiny home shelter, and then moved into the North Seattle apartment where they currently live.
Yeah, just to cut in, Troy, that church is well known for our audience because of the overwhelming number of asylum seekers who were staying there. The pastor there, Jan Bolerjack, kind of became a well-known figure in the Seattle area because she had stepped up to provide shelter and was quite frankly overwhelmed at a number of points because there weren't any other housing options. So they did spend time at that church. What happened next?
Yeah, and just to be clear, since you mentioned it, I did talk to the Reverend there about this, and she remembered the family. She said to me that this family arrived traumatized, a bit bewildered with being in a new place, and so they were there at that encampment, and then they at some point decided to flee the United States. Their asylum case came into flux, and they tried to cross the border into Canada, where they ended up in Customs and Border Protection custody.
And what sparked that decision that they were in the process for asylum, but now they were going to leave the country? Why?
So I should say that immigration courts are not as transparent as the typical court system here. So I have not seen the direct documentation about what was going through their case. So we have a little conflicting narratives here where we know that the ACLU of Washington, who has stepped in with this family, has said that the family's asylum case is still open, but the family became scared enough that they felt like they had to flee into Canada, where they did intend to seek asylum in Canada. Customs and Border Protection, on their end of things, they say that the case was actually closed and that a judge told them to self-deport and that they weren't supposed to self-deport up into Canada.
And again, I mentioned that this was a one-room detention facility that they were in, like a one-room cell, basically. And this is a family of 6. Can you just describe more about the conditions of how they were detained?
Yeah, this is a family of 6. We have not laid eyes ourselves on this holding room where they were at. But the mother who we did talk to described it like a jail cell. I should mention too that the mother, in addition to caring for four children with her partner, one of those children is only 11 months old and was born in the United States, and the mother is in her third trimester of pregnancy for another child. And so this family, if you can imagine it, is sharing a holding cell where there's only a couple of steel benches, according to the family. There's a single toilet that they all have to share. There is not, according to the mother, adequate bedding. I'm talking about blankets and other coverings. The mother described her child, her 13-year-old, was able to lay down head to toe and almost cover the entire width of the room to give you a sense of the size.
And how did that affect the family? What was the result of that detention, being in such a tiny space with a toilet and 6 of them for more than 3 weeks?
I can tell you that talking with the mother for even as brief as I was able to, it was clear that she was still very traumatized by the experience. It was difficult for her to talk about it. And I think the most glaring anecdote that they provided to us in this process was that their oldest child, the 13-year-old, had, after spending so much time there in this windowless room, had begun to threaten self-harm. And according to the mother, even when they tried to bring this to the attention of federal officers at the facility, they still weren't able to get very much help.
What is the typical process of detaining somebody like this? When somebody's trying to cross the border, it turns out that they can't go to Canada. It sounds like detention is standard in these cases. Certainly not for 3 weeks, though, right, Troy? I mean, what usually happens here?
Yeah, correct. It's, I think, first thing is to be clear that part of the complication with their intention to head into Canada is the fact that Canada has an agreement with the United States that states that an asylum seeker from the U.S. cannot come into Canada and seek asylum there as well. So Canadian officials would have sent the family back regardless. What is interesting and difficult about this particular case was that we know now that the family spent close to 24 days there, and the policy that Customs and Border Protection have with these detentions is to hold them for a maximum of 72 hours. So that's 3 days. So the family, by the time that it became known to us that they had been detained, they had blown well past the best practices according to CBP guidelines.
We see a lot of people in immigration detention these days. There have been people at SeaTac, people at the Tacoma ICE facility, where there is community awareness, where people are showing up and demonstrating in support of detainees. Was this family able to contact anybody when they were being detained for so long? I mean, what was the process of getting the word out?
That's a really good question, and I don't have a great answer right now because when we asked the ACLU of Washington about this, they only said that quote unquote community members had become aware at some point of this family's detention. And I think you're right to draw a parallel to the ICE detention center in Tacoma, for example, where U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, it's a different federal agency. When you're detained by them, there are different rules and policies in place that immigrants' rights advocates will tell you are actually closer to a standard prison. There's visitation, there's access by attorneys. These holding rooms at Customs and Border Protection don't have those same policies. And so that's partly what ACLU of Washington has talked about with us is the family's inability to really reach the outside world for much of this. And so these community members who did become aware, however they became aware, then started raising red flags with advocacy groups and state and federal lawmakers who then began to reach out and inquire with CBP about this family's status.
The Trump administration, in fact, has taken steps to curb protections for detainees in CPB custody, as you report. What are some of those changes?
There's two in particular that are really applicable in this case. We know that in May, early May, the head of Customs and Border Protection had rescinded four Biden era policies that all of which were designed to improve the conditions or at least dictate some more clearer guidelines about the conditions that CBP agents would be using to detain vulnerable people like pregnant women. Things like, when to provide fresh diapers or baby formula. And we also know that the Trump administration also in May has begun asking a federal judge to end federal oversight into a settlement agreement that the Customs and Border Protection is in that really strictly regulates how they detain children. And so
That's the Flores
both of
settlement.
Yep, exactly. It's the Flores settlement. And so both of those, the Flores settlement plus those earlier CBP policies that I mentioned, are directly related to how this agency cares for families like this.
Hmm. As I'm reading your story, Troy, which, folks should check out on the Oregon Public Broadcasting website, it felt to me like this family, at some point in the asylum process, they get scared because obviously there's a lot of immigration enforcement in the news. They seem to be confused about the next steps or what they should do. And it felt to me like they might have either gotten bad legal advice or no advice at some point in this process, which led them to frankly freak out and try to leave or be confused and try to leave. Can you tell if this family was appropriately represented or advised here from a legal standpoint?
My answer here certainly speaks to the murkiness of the immigration courts. I think I mentioned it a little bit ago that they aren't nearly as publicly accessible as a traditional state-run court system or even the federal court system. And so we don't, as I mentioned earlier, have a clear answer as to how their asylum case was unfolding, what sorts of representation they had. We do know that their most recent immigration attorney just declined to answer follow-up questions when we asked to see the documents related to their federal asylum case. And I think that also just speaks to how difficult it is for a family to understand exactly what it is that they're supposed to be doing. We know that the family fled into Canada because, according to the ACLU of Washington, they thought that that's what they were supposed to do. They thought that they were doing the right thing by heading into Canada because they were under the impression that they were being told at some point and in some fashion that whether they were to leave immediately or that they felt like they were going to be asked to leave soon, they felt like self-deporting was the answer.
Troy, there is evidence right now in the streets of Los Angeles of the stepped up aggressiveness of immigration enforcement under the Trump administration. In many ways, the reduction of guardrails for the treatment of people as they are going through the immigration process. And I take from your story another angle on this, which is this fear factor that people are experiencing and the confusion because of the stepped up enforcement. And that's leading people to maybe make some understandably ill-advised decisions. I mean, did you hear from any immigration advocates that this is happening more and more, that people are getting scared and trying to leave or taking kind of rash action that maybe doesn't lead to the best outcomes? Now, I'm not trying to blame this family for what happened to them. I'm just trying to understand if this is happening more and more.
Yeah, immigrants' rights advocates will tell you that so much of the tactics that we've seen recently at the orders of the Trump administration have disrupted a lot of what they believe that they should be doing in the first place. I'm talking about going to court hearings, even dropping their kids off at schools. These have become places where immigrants have expected that this is the ways in which they're to go about their daily lives are now also places where they're fearful of running into ICE agents, ICE officers, and becoming deported. So it's really disrupting a lot of the rules that immigrants think that they should be complying with in the first place. So that's one thing. The other aspect to this that's I think is interesting is we're seeing an increase in northern border detentions, just like this family. We know that since the Trump administration has taken over, there have been more reports of people, families trying to cross over into Canada from Michigan State, from New York State. And so that increase here as well along the northern border in the last 5.5 months, I would say certainly also speaks up to how this stepped up enforcement from the Trump administration is impacting a lot of immigrants in the country.
You mentioned that the ACLU is involved. They're investigating. Do we have an indication of what is next for this family of 6 who were detained by Customs and Border Protection at the Canadian border in the Blaine Crossing area for more than 3 weeks in a single room? I can't say that enough. It's very remarkable, the conditions under which they were detained. Do we know what's next for this family at this point, Troy?
We do know that ACLU of Washington is actively investigating the family's claims to see if there were any civil rights abuses to take to court. That's separate from their immigration case, where we're told that the family is still pursuing asylum actively in the United States and is going through that process right now.
Thank you so much for your reporting, Troy Brynelson, reporter at Oregon Public Broadcasting, who broke this story about this family. I really appreciate you, Troy. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Libby.
And you're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. Seattle has seen some protests this week in solidarity with what's happening in Los Angeles. On Monday, about 300 people marched to Seattle City Hall to protest the arrest of SEIU California President David Huerta. That demonstration was peaceful. Yesterday, several dozen anti-ICE protesters used Lime bikes and bird scooters to temporarily block DHS vehicles at the federal building downtown. There are more protests planned in our area today, including at Cal Anderson Park, and much wider rallies planned across our region for Saturday as part of the nationwide No Kings protest, which is counter-programming for President Trump's military parade in Washington, D.C. KUOW reporter Joshua McNichols caught up with Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell and asked about protests this morning.
Okay, second question is, what's your message to people who would be protesting anything happening at the federal level? We saw what happened in Los Angeles. I'm wondering what your message to lawful protesters is here.
My message to lawful protesters are I stand with you. We don't agree with the policies coming out of D.C. Be loud, be organized, but also understand that these need to be lawful protests. So, we have to still protect everybody. So I want to make sure that the protesters understand that my administration, this whole city stands behind or opposing what we see coming out of D.C. We are a welcoming city, and we are proud of that. And this is particularly important in a month where we're celebrating Pride and we're celebrating our immigrant refugee communities and Juneteenth. So protest, but certainly comply with the law. That's what we're asking.
That's Mayor Bruce Harrell speaking with our own Joshua McNichols today at Seattle Center. Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.